And so now I want to welcome our next speaker, which is Dr. Tamberly-Conway. She is the founder and CEO of Conservation Connections, and she is joining us from South Korea. Is that right?
I am, Jacob. Good
Well,
morning,
welcome,
and
good morning.
Good early morning from over here. All right. Thank you so much, Jacob, and what an honor it is to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you. And I feel honored as well to fall upon the heels of Michael's powerful presentation. I sense so many intertwinings of what Michael just shared with us and what I plan to share with you today. And again, I'm just grateful to the Oregon Society of American Foresters for opening this opportunity for such a variety of discussions around the forestry sector and how we might begin to notice and recognize different ways to approach how we manage forests as humans. And what I'll share with you today is a bit about forest therapy, otherwise called forest bathing, some forest immersion, and how this might serve as a real gateway to healing both people and forests. And I'm really honored to be here joining you from South Korea, where I am attending the World Forestry Congress. And I feel like I'm wrapped in the leadership of the South Korean government and institutes who, in my opinion, are leading globally in this realm of forest therapy. And so I'll share a little bit about this practice and ways that we might consider how we could utilize this practice as a management tool, even similarly to what Michael was just sharing. And I had the real honor of serving as a conservation education specialist and partnerships, diversity, and inclusion specialist in both Texas and Washington, D.C. with the USDA Forest Service and their conservation education program for 12 years. And during that time is when I kind of discovered this practice of forest therapy or forest bathing, and thinking that I was a nature girl throughout my entire life. And I remember thinking as I went on my first forest therapy walk that, oh, I'm sure I've done this before. And I realized after about 20 minutes of a 3-hour forest therapy session that no, I'd never actually been led into a practice of this nature. And so after that first walk, I knew that this is something that I wanted to weave into my work in conservation education. And so I had really the honor of having leadership who were innovative in their ideas of, hey, let's give this a try. It sounds like it's something that does dovetail into our work as conservation education, bringing people in deeper connection with the land and becoming better stewards. And so in 2019, I actually left the Forest Service very amicably. I went to our chief's office and she embraced me saying, yes, move forward in this work of conservation education, but also around this whole realm of health and nature connections and forest and human connections. And so I founded my own small business, Conservation Connections, and then recently became a member as a Dovetail Partners Associate. And so just really kind of branching out into the world with this practice and hoping to bring this practice to the world as so many of my colleagues are doing, both internal to the Forest Service as former colleagues and externally as well. So I'll share a bit of background about forest therapy or forest bathing, and then how we might couple this nature relationship building with our traditional ways of conservation education, citizen science, management, and how this practice might actually support our land tending practices. And using some examples of recovery, as Michael was sharing, of healing traumas of people and their disconnectedness, and also healing the natural world through this process. And then how we're weaving this practice into the conservation networks and even implementing into public policy. So just as some background, we as humans are deeply rooted in the natural world. We used to spend 100% of our time in the natural world, but over time, we've really lost a lot of that nature connection throughout human history. Now, we know that most individuals in the US spend about 90% of their time indoors. And what happened was in the early 80s, after there was an incredible spike in chronic disease, also an increased suicide rates, the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries noticed that there was an issue because they were transitioning from a very agriculturally focused economy to one that was much more digitized and industrialized, where people were spending more time indoors behind computers, in this very, very different mechanism of life than what they were used to. And so they started noticing these real shifts in society. And so they began this practice, they coined the term Shinrin-yoku, or otherwise known as forest bathing, which really literally translated as bathing in the atmosphere of the forest. And so as we sit under trees or just in the natural world where plants and trees are exuding these chemicals called phytoncides, these are volatile chemicals in the air that actually are being produced as their own immune system. So when they're being attacked, for instance, by an insect, a disease, a fungi, then they begin to emit these phytoncides and actually serve as communication systems among trees, sometimes even of other species, but within species as well, to help note that there are threats on the horizon. And this also happening underground in the mycelial networks of communication. But these phytoncides, it was really enlightening and a surprise, as Michael was noting, that these phytoncides actually help us. They help to reduce our stress, our cortisol levels. And we know that cortisol levels or high levels of stress are related to so much of the chronic disease that we experience in our society. And so these phytoncides help to reduce our cortisol levels, thereby reducing stress. They increase our natural killer cells. So therefore, they are increasing these natural killer cells that are attacking cancer and other autoimmune diseases. They overall increase our immune function, these phytoncides. And again, they serve to support the communication systems among forest communities. Sure, all right. Not advancing. There we go. So we noticed that the Japanese government and then the South Korean government, other entities began to reach out and really engage in so much research that now it's been over 40 years of research, truly, even the research of Dr. Kathleen Wolf looking at urban green space and health. And so we know through all of this research throughout the world that nature and forest really serve as restorative mechanisms for humans. And there are many doctors, medical professionals throughout the world who are using this method of nature prescriptions for burnout prevention strategies. Now, many corporations are integrating this type of practice into their employee resilience. So we know that all of these positive effects of nature, including cognitive, emotional, physical benefits, mental, physical, and emotional health and wellness, and really helps to increase our attention capacity, concentration, creativity. Just the list goes on and on of what nature does for us. And then the practice that I'll be sharing more about today, because this is the practice in which I was trained, called from the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, really helps people to get out of your mind and into your body with initiating the 5 senses that we all know: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. But as we guide people into these sensory connections or invitations, we help to open our systems to even more of the senses that we as humans have really begun to lose over time, because we're not bringing them to surface. And so this practice helps to reopen and reignite some of those senses that really support us. Intuition helps to increase our intuition and our imaginal sense that often as adults we tend to lose. Imagine ourselves as children. So this brings us back into kind of a childlike realm of remembering, and that is part of recovery. And so this forest therapy that I'll be sharing is really gaining global recognition. Now, forest therapy as a whole, as I mentioned here in South Korea, this is a practice that is embedded throughout the nation. I'll share more of that in a bit. But this is a very evidence-based approach to health and wellness of people. But I tend to think that this also ties to the health and wellness of our forest ecosystems and other ecosystems. Now, on forest therapy walks that we be guided by ANFT certified guides, and there are about 2,000 around the world, a little over 1,000 now in the US. And when I began, I think there were like 250 guides in the world. So this has really been expansive work. And what happens is we guide people into these sensory connections using invitations, slow, gentle walks or saunters. It's really, David was talking earlier with his intro remarks about, about running and getting from point A to point B, and he was noticing all of the things along the way, but in a very broad form, I believe. And one of the things that happens with forest therapy is that it's really not about getting from point A to point B. It's not about getting to anywhere. It's about being in the here and now and being in the present moment. And so sometimes we might go less than half a mile. I mean, I've been on walks where we would go less than a few hundred meters. And so this is one way to really call attention to our sensory experiences in the natural world. And through these invitations, the standard sequence of invitations that we use in this forest therapy practice that really open the doors for healing and open the doors for relationship building with ourselves, with other people in the group, and with the natural world. And we are just in this frenetic pace on a daily basis, and we don't give ourselves time to slow down. So this is one way that we can do so and develop relationship through that practice. Because really, when the relationship between humans and the more than human world is where the actual healing or recovery actually begins, and we start to notice things in the natural world that life and death, and just this that we are nature too. And it is something very beautiful to witness others sharing and then also being witnessed. And so a part of this forest therapy practice, again, that is the ANFT practice, is pulsing out on these invitations. It might be for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then we call people back in to join in the circle. And this is where people share and they're being witnessed in their shares. And there's a lot of cultural repair that happens here. And I would say a lot of communal healing, because people notice similarities. They may note differences. This has been really powerful in diverse groups of people and diverse audiences. And especially now with the onset of with the pandemic, people are in need of connection. And one of the things that our motto is, the forest is the therapist. The guide simply opens the doors, because we know that nature gives us what we need to heal. We receive so much from the natural world every single day, but this is a different way to go in and receive, but also give. And again, just a bit about the history. I started this practice and actually became trained as a certified guide during my tenure with the U.S. Forest Service in Washington, D.C. And there we initiated the first Nature and Forest Therapy Collaborative. We actually used this practice in one of our strategic planning sessions, opening the 3-day session with a 1.5-hour forest therapy session by a local guide in DC. And when I became a guide, there were only like 2 guides in all of DC. And now I would venture to say there are probably about 40 to 50 guides in Washington, DC alone. And this is, say, 4 years ago. And, again, we partnered with medical professionals of the Lone Star Family Health Center in Texas, ParkRx America, Dr. Robert Czar. If many of you may have heard of Dr. Czar and his Nature RX or ParkRx program. He now focuses much more on Nature RX and even, trees and what does it look like to prescribe trees as therapy. And he also became an ANFT certified forest therapy guide and worked very closely with Dr. Kathy Wolf to create an evidence and action CME and CEU credit that supports this type of work. And also during this time in which I was with the Forest Service, I was able to procure funding under my program, under Partnerships, Diversity, and Inclusion, to support the training of individuals from diverse communities, and also fund walks, forest therapy walks on National Public Lands events and in diverse communities. And then I myself was supported in my training. And then now I believe there are 3 other forest therapy guides who are actually currently employees of the Forest Service. And so we all work very closely together. Now I'm from the outside in, but I still feel this is my Forest Service family, and it's been very obvious and very apparent, which I'll share more with you about that. Just one anecdote that I'd like to share: Dr. Daniel Porter from Lone Star Family Health Center and John Warner, who was the urban district forester, who's now retired, but he helped to bring this practice into Texas. And I'm currently in Texas, and I'd have to say, that was a huge feat, because I would just say Texas, of all the states, was one of those that I thought, how is this going to be accepted by the Texas A&M Forest Service and other entities in Texas? And he actually brought this work in collaboration with me and other local forest therapy guides that were trained using funding from the Forest Service to bring this work to the Jones State Forest. And that really planted a seed of forest therapy or forest bathing expansion. And forest bathing is not really one of those terms that the Texas A&M Forest Service, they kind of, bristled at it. And so the practice is forest therapy, and that's the terminology we like to use. And this really weaved into their work with Healthy Trees, Healthy Lives from the Southern group of state foresters that launched this kind of movement. And now there are many other state forester associations that have really, weaved their own work into this Healthy Trees, Healthy Lives campaign. And so I think there was a lot of interest in the forest therapy practice because they could see that this brought people into deeper connection with local urban forests, and this was a way that we could kind of couple those messages. Now, one of the things that really arose during my time there with the Forest Service is utilizing some funding to support the very first ever bilingual ANFT forest therapy training. My work has focused primarily on reaching Latino audiences. Over many, many years, that was my master's and doctoral work, focused on how to improve programs and opportunities for Latino communities and Latino community engagement. And so we trained 22 individuals from different Latino communities, and 15 of them graduated, and focused on bringing this practice to a variety of communities that they were focused upon in their own necks of the woods. And one was a federal employee in the Institute of Tropical Forestry in Puerto Rico. There was a veteran who, upon participating in a walk that I delivered for National Public Lands Day, he approached me after this 2-hour forest therapy walk and said, I'm a veteran and this practice needs to be brought to veterans. And I said, well, we're having a training in about a month here in Puerto Rico. Would you like to apply? And when he applied, we all said, hands down, yes, Carlos needs to be a part of this training. And so, educators, one of the individuals was actually, she had just been diagnosed for the second time at the age of 32 with breast cancer. And she decided that she would utilize this as a part of her own healing journey. And she is now cancer-free and uses this practice with other oncology patients and cancer thrivers. And of course, many folks have utilized this in mental health and suicide prevention. Now, this was a very interesting cohort because this was focusing also on post-hurricane recovery of people and the land in Puerto Rico. They had, Hurricane Maria had just ravished the entire island. And so people were in major recovery mode, mentally, physically, emotionally, and then the land as well. And so this was really an essence. And what spurred from this is the first ever forest therapy trail, a certified forest therapy trail that is not yet fully certified, but it is very close because the National Forest Foundation funded this actual trail because of the restoration and recovery components of both veteran recovery and hurricane recovery of both communities and the land. So really wrapping that recovery piece that Michael was so beautifully sharing earlier, and the healing and recovery of people in the land together. Now, another thing that happened right after the November training was when the world changed, and in March, everything began to shut down, and all of these guides were in this process of training. And so as a part of training, you have to lead forest therapy sessions or walks in order to complete your training. And so Dr. Tennille Bestum at the U.S. Forest Service, who was one of my former supervisors, agreed to kind of pilot this effort where these guides in training could lead remote forest therapy sessions to support the healing and resiliency of Forest Service employees. And this was happening now by April. It was kind of happening all over the world. There were guides, myself included, who, and I'm like a Luddite. I don't really enjoy the digital technology world, but I realized this is the only way we have to bring this practice to people. And so it's been really powerful to bring people from all over the world together in a digital format like Zoom. That's what I use and what most use. And then guiding them through the same invitation, the same standard sequence, having them pulse out and come back into this circle and sharing and noticing people from Canada, from Costa Rica, from all over the world. They would come together. And so having them notice these different natural environments in which they were moving forward in their own healing. And so the U.S. Forest Service, both International Program Office and domestic, really picked up on this practice. And we were able to engage guides again around the world, and bilingual guides, to support a variety of groups, both internal to the Forest Service and external partners. One of the guides at the Forest Service actually works with young people coming into the agency under the Resource Assistant Program, and many of them have said that this practice has been critical to their retention even, and just to their time with the Forest Service. And we had the opportunity to guide with the Women's Forest Congress, and that's how I became involved and connected with Dovetail partners and as an associate. And so it's just been a really incredible journey. And in March, late March, I'd been sitting under these trees. I flew out of DC to just come to Lubbock, Texas, shallow water in this case. And I was going to be there for 2 weeks and then return, and everything shut down, and so we were all in this worldwide transition. And I would go out to these very few trees that my husband and I just purchased property in shallow water, Texas. And so we were moving into our new home, and I would sit under these trees like as a real coping mechanism. There was a lot of shifts happening, and And I remember being guided into forest therapy. It was my first remote forest therapy experience. And I thought, what is this going to be about? And the third invitation was really about connecting to an individual. And I sat under this tree that I've been sitting under for about a month. And all of a sudden, it was like a 20-minute invitation. And I'm noticing with all of my senses this individual tree. And suddenly, it was like out of nowhere, there popped all of these egg casings that were weaved into the bark. And I realized, oh my, this tree is sick, and what's going on? So then I used iNaturalist and my citizen science skills and discovered that it was elm leaf beetles and an elm leaf beetle invasion, an invasive species, and so I would probably not have noticed that had I not slowed down enough to really recognize. And so really noticing what oneself and other beings need, so that more than human world. And then kind of flipping over to, how this can support trauma recovery. And this practice was supporting trauma recovery in the face of COVID and supporting communities in their mental health. Everyone was having mental health issues during, still, we're seeing that being very pervasive in university settings and medical professional, healthcare fields, and also in post-wildfire trauma recovery. So this one particular cohort was initiated a little over a year ago in Chico, California, after the Paradise Fire, when someone from this area approached ANFT and requested the opportunity to engage in a cohort where it was supported by the local municipality. So they paid for all of these 15 individuals who were first responders, counselors, healthcare professionals, conservation professionals, to come together and train. And then now they are utilizing this practice to really help in the recovery of people after this poor event, and then also healing around their loss, but also their reconnection with the land, because people after an incident like this are very upset with the natural world. And so it takes a lot to have that kind of recovery, and forest therapy is one of those ways that they're utilizing to bring nature and people back together. And so this then led to another idea, because we're really focusing on preserving the health of our ecosystems, but conservation professionals are also susceptible to kind of eco-anxiety and burnout. I mean, as Michael was mentioning, we're facing some of the world's most important decisions and how we move forward with working with the land. And this is also a way that we can support one another in social networks, increase our skills around well-being, and utilize these in our daily practice. And this is a wonderful way to strategize, helping people to survive and thrive in their own connection with the natural world and with stewardship. And so the idea was to bring together an array of conservation leaders. And so that, because I had trained at the Forest Service, several of my colleagues had trained, the Texas Forest Service seemed interested, and so I approached ANFT, and they agreed to move forward with this training. And so we just launched this training in April of this year. And so this is a way to kind of spread this practice among the conservation and forestry communities. There are people from American Forests, the Texas A&M Forest Service, Latino community organizations, forest health specialists from Davie Resource Group. I mean, it's really amazing to see these people come together. Now they're also housed in the cohort with other individuals who aren't necessarily conservation leaders, but this is a way to bring those folks together to have the perspectives from the conservation-minded world. And again, it's just a way to really help propel the forest therapy practice in the conservation realm. And then there's a real interest among Forest Service, domestic and international programs to really mainstream this practice in the Forest Service. I heard it with my own 2 ears, and it was amazing to hear from leaders from one of my former supervisors, Michiko Martin, who is really, I think, at the forefront of being such an innovator. She's always been quite the innovator, and she now serves as a regional forester in Region 3 in the Southwestern region. But, these are really developing avenues to ways that we might be able to manage differently. And I think she's very interested in that. It's about developing relationship and inspiring reciprocity, because when people love something, then they want to protect it, conserve it, know about it, understand it, learn more, and so that's to me where then the conservation education piece comes in. This is, to me, again, a beautiful gateway to help people open to the natural world around them, to really see the forest for the trees, and then also to really notice the finest details and the interconnections in the natural world. And then this really inspires reciprocity. I mean, after walks, we often have people saying, what can we do? What can we do to support, to help? And I think this can lead to citizen science and, citizen science leadership, and also sound management practices to encourage healthy forests and healthy people. So one of the, I guess, visions that I've held for quite some time, and that many of my colleagues hold as well, is to really weave these healthy forests and healthy communities together by integrating, say, tree planting, for instance, with the forest therapy practice, like not only in the planting, but the pre-planning. So utilizing forest therapy with communities as a form of community engagement to help in the planning of spaces where these trees are going to be planted in an urban setting, or having the community engagement piece be weaved together into this kind of a network, and then utilizing the forest therapy practice during planting and post-planting, so that each month there would be an offering of forest therapy to support the health and wellness of people. But again, forest therapy to me is for the forest as well. And so looking at this as more of a whole health model, maybe even integrating forest therapy trails and a model of supporting the growing of healthy forests and healthy people. And not forgetting about our soils. Michael mentioned Dr. Suzanne Simard, and really the research that's coming out, understanding the real benefits of creating these healthy soil environments to help create these healthy forests that then create healthy people. It's just this interwoven effect. And so not to forget about that. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Won-Sop Shin, who is the former minister of the Korea Forest Service. I met him about 4 years ago when he was in California, and now he's actually a professor and of the Graduate Department of Forest Therapy at Chungju National University, and the president of the Korea Forest Therapy Forum. He left the Forest Service to actually bring this forest therapy into public policy as forest welfare. And so now here in South Korea, there is an implementation of the Forest Welfare Act. And so this is bringing the forest therapy to people who may not otherwise be able to engage in these activities. So they get coupons essentially to be able to participate in many of these programs. And it is from cradle to grave, life with forests. And just to give you an example, so forest welfare, again, is offering this economic, social, and emotional support of people and their well-being. And it's delivered by the Korea Forest Welfare Institute. This is who I've been invited to join in this World Forestry Congress, and in a particular session in which we're focusing on forests and human health. And just to show you, I mean, they have an entire forest welfare program by life cycle, from prenatal all the way till death. And so they actually have burials on their forest lands and these healing forests. And so there are individuals who are trained, and by the way, these are not my slides, these are slides of Mr. Hugh Kim, who is one of the managers of the Forest Welfare Institute. And so he's allowed me to share these with you all as kind of a case study. And also they're using forest therapy for firefighters. These 3-day tours at the forest therapy centers that now are speckled throughout the nation, and training different experts in different areas. And so there are different forest therapy instructors and interpreters, forest therapists. So it's really kind of across the board, and propelling this into business. So again, this is a career pathway for our future here in the US and globally, and how we might utilize our forests, private lands, public lands, urban forest centers to really create these forest therapy centers, forest therapy trails, forest therapy opportunities. And we will actually be visiting a National Center for Forest Therapy during our stay. And we will actually be visiting the very first Forest Therapy Center, and we'll be meeting with a number of researchers. So we'll be able to look at potential opportunities for collaboration among the Korea Forest Welfare Institute, Korea Forest Therapy Forum, the U.S. Forest Service, and the University of British Columbia, and Conservation Connections. So we're really excited to be able to visit the first Forest Therapy Center, Gyeongju, and we'll be there for a couple of days. This will fall in the middle of the Congress, but this was the only time that they could offer this to a number of delegates. There'll be about 20 delegates, many from the Forest Service, USAID, Forest Service partner organizations. And so we're really thrilled. I invite you all to our next, and we've had a series of discussions. Michiko Martin, who's my former supervisor, who's now the regional forester, when she was asked to present during the World Forestry Congress, she offered this opportunity to hold a discussion series in which we've been inviting researchers from the various research units associated with the Forest Welfare Institute, as well as top leaders from the Forest Welfare Institute who've been sharing their stories, and a number of forest therapy guides in the US. Some have been US Forest Service employees, and the folks from Chico who engaged in that special cohort. They shared their story of recovery, of both human and land recovery. So it's just been kind of across the board, and you know how even here in the US we're using forest therapy to support wildland firefighters and their own recovery, and the communities that the Forest Service serves. So this is just really an expanding opportunity, and I feel that what we're about to experience here in South Korea during the World Forestry Congress, and during our next event, which will be May 2nd, which is 1730 to 1900. That's time here, so it'll be very early in the morning for you all. But these will be archived. All of these are archived, and I'll be happy to share the links with Jacob and Lauren, so that if you're interested in going back in time and looking at some of these really powerful presentations. We had Dr. Kathleen Wolf, who reflected on 2 presentations by researchers talking about managing forest resources to support forest and, or rather, human health and wellness, and how we might think about forest resources a little bit differently as well, like thinking about aromas, or thinking about the tactile elements within a healing forest. And these healing forests that they were talking about in particular are in urban settings. So also there was a really wonderful presentation about the importance of canopy cover, and you know where we're going into the future with thermal issues. And so I think those would be of great interest to this particular audience with SAF. And so we just invite you to join us if you are able. And I believe it would probably be about 1, 2, 3 in the morning in many of your necks of the woods. But if you can't join us again, we will definitely offer the opportunity for an archived version of this presentation. And we'll have University of British Columbia, Uppsala University, Sweden, Dr. Terry Hartig, and then the Korea Forest Welfare Institute, who will be sharing their stories. And Dr. Won-Sop Shin will open, as well as the president of the Forest Welfare Institute, Mr. Chang Lee. And so we are just grateful for the opportunity to to be here in Seoul to really carry this work forward. And I feel like when Jacob and Lauren approached me about presenting, I thought that I just felt, this was such a synergy to be able to share this with the Oregon Society of American Foresters, to plant the seed of potential opportunity for continued connection, communication, expansion. And so I'm really grateful to you, Jacob and Lauren, and to the committee for inviting me to join you all today. And I'm really fascinated that you brought on Michael Paul Nelson. It's really just wonderful to hear his very different perspective and view that I feel weaves into this work, because I do believe that it will be important for us to really listen and to move into more heartfelt communication with the more than human world, the sentient beings around us. And we have a lot to learn from the natural world, and that can help us to apply really strong, well-founded management practices and interconnections that can help us to manage the future of our forests. And so with that, I thank you all, just deepest gratitude to each of you for your time today. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions that anyone may have.
Well, we're thankful that you could join us, Tamberly, from across the world. And thank you so much for that excellent presentation. We do have a few minutes for questions. I see there's 2 already, but if there's any others, please type them into the Q&A box. The first one is connections a stylized version of connections, or a new developing word with its own meaning? OED definition, I assume Oxford English Dictionary, related to forest therapy.
So I guess that is in reference to my business name, Connections. Whenever I guess I like to say fledged from the Forest Service, I really wanted to continue in my work of connecting people, connecting organizations and agencies, and connecting people to the land. And also I was kind of propelled around my work in diversity and inclusion, and again with my Spanish language background and my heart center for the Latino community, I was also trying to kind of weave in the conexiones. So it's kind of just a melding of all of those together. And I guess it's not really a term that's being utilized yet, but I really do feel that, creating connections with oneself, with others, and with the land or the more than human world is critical to us moving forward in society as a part of nature and not separate from. I think oftentimes we as humans forget that we are actually nature, and that things that are happening in our lives oftentimes we think are only happening to us. But if we really look around us, and I think this happens oftentimes in forest therapy, is that people slow down and they start to notice that nature can sometimes be brutal. There is life and death. There is this whole spectrum in between, and suddenly individuals feel more connected to the natural world, and they start to notice that they too are living a life of nature. And so that connectedness is very powerful. Thank you for the question. I've never had that one before.
The next one, I teach 6th graders at an environmental learning center. What subjects do you recommend for 11 to 12-year-olds? I do utilize project learning tree modules, but would you suggest others? If so, which ones?
That's a very good question. And it's interesting that you mentioned project learning tree. That was one of my primary focal areas in the Forest Service, as the Forest Service serves as a primary funder of project learning tree. And I'm not sure, about the demographics of your teachers and your students, but there are a number of Spanish and well, other language materials as well that were developed in collaboration. So I just wanted to make note of that. Also, they're propelling this whole use of iTree to support, and that age level or that age range is what the iTree, Project Learning Tree iTree was actually developed for. So I want to make sure to note that in the case that you weren't aware. But one of the exciting things happening with this new cohort of conservation leaders is that JC Tosh, who is the Conservation Education Coordinator for the Texas A&M Forest Service, is also a co-coordinator for the Project Learning Tree program. And so for years now, I've been kind of, you know, I guess, talking to different people. And when I was in the Washington office, I had the opportunity to share these ideas of somehow incorporating this nature and forest therapy practice even into some of the Project Learning Tree curriculum. And so I know this is a shared vision that JC would like to move forward. So it's really exciting to know that we'll have some kind of like internal opportunity there with Project Learning Tree. But obviously, you know, Project Wet and Wild, Project Leopold is another phenomenal tool. And I'm hopeful to see more of these opportunities around nature and forest therapy that might serve as actual curricula, because, you know, although I do believe that, you know, in order to create a practice that is reputable and that is one that is of a design for a career pathway, I do believe that individuals need to be trained as either, you know, ANFT is not the only trainer out there. There are a number of training opportunities in forest therapy, nature therapy, ecotherapy, you know, it's kind of across the board. And I do believe that it is important to engage in some form of training. But I know that a lot of individuals coming out are trying to bring this to their communities. And so there are developing practices for youth. And I know a lot of guides, myself included, who lead nature and forest therapy sessions specifically for youth and educators. One of my most powerful experiences was shortly after I became trained, and we were leading a group of about 30 youth. They were all special needs. And one young man was high autism level and, you know, nonverbal. And I remember them saying, "No, don't worry about him. I mean, he's not going to interact at all." And we were out with them for about an hour and a half. And at the end of our walks, I'll give you the little teaser, but we end our walks with the tea ceremony, and it's embodying the land. And so we actually make a tea with something from the land, with a plant from the land. And so we had created the tea, and I asked if anyone would like to share this tea, because we always pour a cup for the land and one for all participants. And so I said, would anyone here care to share a few words and share this tea with the land? And this young man, like, he was about 20 feet away, and he beelined towards me and grabbed a cup of tea and walked away about 5 feet and whispered something in the tea. I'm getting full body chills as I think of this and remember this now. And then he poured it on the ground. And I mean, everyone was like dumbfounded. This practice needs to be brought to children, needs to be brought to youth. And so I would welcome you reaching out to me, and I can find some additional resources that would be supportive of your journey in education, certainly. And I hope to see this become weaved more deeply into the work of conservation and environmental education. If that was helpful.
So we are out of time. There is one more question, but maybe I can send that over to you, Tamberly, and then you can try to answer it in the chat really quick. But so we're going to move on to our break. But first, we have a raffle. Tamberly, if you could let Dan share his screen really quick. So our first raffle winner for the Dictionary of Forestry is Ken Nygren. So congratulations, Ken. We'll make sure and get that to you after the meeting. So now we have our first break. So we will come back at 10 o'clock for our next session.